Hello and bonjour from New York. My name is Kevin LaGrandeur. I'm a professor at NYIT here in New York, and I'm also a fellow of the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technology and a co-founder of the New York Post-Human Research Group. The title of my presentation today is Early Warnings, Renaissance Proto-androids and Social Dangers. First, I'd like to mention that this presentation is the result of 25 years of research and publication on the topic of the prehistory of AI in literature and culture. More specifically, this paper derives from my book, Artificial Slaves, published by Routledge in 2013, and also from my latest article on this subject in the book, AI Narratives, edited by Stephen Cave and et al., published by Oxford University Press last year. The Renaissance provides a fascinating site for the investigation of the prehistory of contemporary AI and some of the social, political, and ethical questions it raises, both in its own time and in anticipation of ours, because the artificial intelligences imagined in that period exist at the point of transition between magical and empirical science. This means that although the real and fictional creations of the Renaissance are in part the products of the intellectual culture that existed before the empirical turn of Newton, Descartes, and their contemporaries, some aspects of these creations anticipate today's cultural, social, and ethical preoccupations with AI. For instance, how beneficial is it to society? How dangerous? How ethical are the motivations of the makers? And just because we can fashion something new and powerful to help us defeat nature's limits, does that mean we should? From Paracelsus's and Cornelius Agrippa's claims to be able to create a miniature human being, that is, a homunculus, to Jewish legends of the golem, to Robert Greene's play about the medieval scientist Roger Bacon's attempt to make a talking brass head, we have, with all of these in the Renaissance, different written accounts, both fictional and supposedly factual, but essentially fictional, of the same kind of project, that is, an innovator's attempt to fashion a superhuman intelligent tool in his own image. It's not only the creation of these androids that anticipates projects of our own time, but also their society's reactions to them. As with today, these kinds of technological innovations ignited in the Renaissance both awe and fear, which is reflected in social responses of the day to men such as Agrippa and Paracelsus, or in stories like Robert Greene's, or the various tales of the golem. The first two men, Agrippa and Paracelsus, were notable enough for their novel ideas to be given important positions in their societies. Agrippa as a noted physician in a number of cities, and Paracelsus as a professor at the University of Basel. But their iconoclasm eventually got them into trouble with the authorities. Agrippa's appointments were ultimately cut short, and Paracelsus was fired from his post as professor and banished from Basel. In Greene's play, the main character's radical notion of creating an intelligent metal android to give lectures on philosophy and build defenses for England against invasion demonstrates his brilliance, but the same character, Friar Bacon, is also depicted as a free-thinking maverick, like the real scientists, Agrippa and Paracelsus, a kind of behavior which leads to disaster. The forces that his invention comprises are too strong to master, and Greene's autonomous metal head ultimately implodes. Similarly, the tales of golems, which I'll get to in a few minutes, often end in catastrophe as the creature's superhuman size and strength prove too much for its human master. So this talk will explore how the idea of creating an intelligent artificial humanoid servant is adapted by the Renaissance from Aristotle's notions of slavery in his Politics, and how that all led to scientific and fictional literary instances of superhuman artificial servants. And finally, how all of this connects with the AI of our time. Throughout this whole episode, the dangers of these powerful servants bring into question the propriety of their creators' behavior and the proper limits of human ambition. So AI's primary purpose throughout its history and prehistory has been to spare its owners from tedious labor. Today's digital technology, including AI, is mostly meant to do work that's dirty, dangerous, or dreary. I call it the 3Ds. For example, police and military forces around the world use bomb disposal robots to spare humans the physical danger of being near possible live explosives. It's also cheaper and more efficient to employ a robot than a human in these kinds of situations. Robots don't need holidays. They don't need food, drink, or sleep, and they don't demand pay raises. And they do exactly as they are told without protest. In other words, artificially intelligent systems are essentially artificial slaves. Aristotle, speaking of slavery, had a wide influence on Renaissance thoughts about human slavery. And the ideas embedded in his disquisition called the Politics regarding artificial slaves would also have been well known to scholars of the Renaissance. By the way, the details of those ideas of Aristotle about artificial servants, that is, proto-robots, is in sections 1253a through 1254b in his Politics. And for more on that, you can see my book, Artificial Slaves. I don't have time to go into too much of it here. Furthermore, this Aristotelian thought on the nature of slaves and tools and how they coincided, that he talks about in the Politics, merges with the science of the Renaissance, which was a blend of Kabbalism, alchemy, Hermetic philosophy, and a burgeoning experimentalism. As I argue in my book and in a number of other articles, this blend of magic and science spurred notions of creating artificial humanoid servants. The chief motivation of those who sought to make them was the same as Aristotle's, that is, to use that servant as a tool to enhance the power of its maker, so the master could supersede his natural limits. Paracelsus, a Renaissance physician and most famous now for being an early advocate of using what we would call pharmaceuticals in place of such things as leeches, bleeding, and humoral medicine, claims to be able to make a homunculus, or a little man, by alchemical means in one of his books. He gives a recipe for doing so in his 16th century work, De Natura Rerum, that is, on the nature of things. And clearly, this is a form of asexual reproduction based on anatomical misunderstandings of the day. The recipe chiefly consists of combining blood and semen in a flask and burying it in an artificial womb made of horse dung to keep it warm for 40 days, and then feeding the resulting humanoid that arises with blood until it matures and can come out of the flask. These artificially made intelligent humanoids could be used as a superhuman replacement for slaves without ethical concerns. This is because, as specified by Aristotle, they're natural slaves. Natural slaves. That is, although these androids have the capacity for understanding, they cannot reason like naturally born people. Aristotle would have said, like Greeks. Therefore, they're humanoid, but not quite human, natural slaves, and can be used like animals. Paracelsus talks about this in his book on pages 230 through 239. So this is the same Aristotelian rationalization used by Juan Sepúlveda in the famous 16th century Spanish slave debates he had with de las Casas. Even better for their makers, such as Paracelsus, in the same time period, is that these creatures, like what he calls wild people or naturals, which is his name for giants, nymphs, pygmies, and the like, have supernatural powers that their creator can take advantage of. Powers such as the ability to know hidden and secret things, as Paracelsus says in his book, and also great forceful beast-like strength. Paracelsus' contemporary, Cornelius Agrippa, who practiced both law and medicine, also wrote of being able to create a homunculus. Like his fellow physician and scholar, Agrippa saw the homunculus as an artificial intelligent slave with superhuman abilities that could be harnessed by his creator. He compares homunculi as a class of naturals to the types of moving statues or automata, that is clockwork robots, that Aristotle mentions in his writing about slaves and intelligent machines, making it clear that they carry the status of natural slaves. Moreover, because the automata and moving statues Agrippa mentions are, as he says, noted in Greek mythologies to have wonderful powers, his reference to them and their connection to Aristotle's ideas evokes not only the homunculus's servile status, but also its potential power. The possibilities of creating artificial android servants put forth by these two men in their scientific writing was seen not only as sensational and daring, but also as dangerous, a key problem for all representations of proto-artificial intelligence of this time. Unfortunately for Agrippa and Paracelsus, they were not only alike in their brilliance and claims of being able to create intelligent androids, they were also alike in their intellectual rebelliousness in an era that valued orthodoxy. As scholars like Hexter and Einstein indicate, not that Einstein, but an Einstein who's a literary historian, during the 16th century, there arose a medieval nostalgia, a retrograde clinging by traditional authorities like the nobility to old, strict social strata and customs. They didn't like the new ambitions of the lower classes, especially the merchant classes. Scholars of the day similarly clung to old intellectual methods built around reverence for ancient texts and ideas. In sympathy with the Elizabethan aristocracy, traditional scholarship in England discouraged newfangled ideas and procedures, such as reliance on personal observation, experience, and experiment. They thought this led to the persecution of people such as Copernicus and Galileo in other countries, which had similar ideas. So, although their ideas may have titillated other alchemists, Paracelsus and Agrippa's publications made them not only notable, but infamous. They were eventually treated with suspicion and even revulsion by society, especially by the authorities. The methods and innovations they promoted relied mainly on direct experience and experiment rather than on received authority. Again, I go into this more deeply in my book. Additionally, they both were pugnacious about their ideas and their rejection of tradition. In the end, both of them were hounded by the authorities from town to town in their later years. There's also a Kabbalistic tradition for making an android called the golem. And although it originated as a mystical rabbinical practice among Jewish rabbis to imitate and contemplate God's creation of Adam, by the time of the Renaissance, this android's purpose was much more practical. It was intended to defend the Jewish community from genocidal attacks by their Christian neighbors, known as pogroms. The attacks were known as pogroms. However, the creation of a golem was sometimes seen as dangerous even by Jewish commentators because its tremendous power could cause accidental danger to its creator and to the Jewish community. So it was seen as a rogue practice of one sort or another by both Christians and Jews eventually. Now, it has clear connections to the homunculus as an artificial servant and one of great superhuman power as well. Although most legends of the golem depict it as made of earth, some have also depicted it made of other more normal building materials such as wood and metal. These materials show a connection with the sorts of robotic androids of today and the metal automaton depicted by Robert Greene in his Renaissance play, which I'll discuss next. All of the foregoing types of artificial intelligence servants, which were supposed to be real ones, are echoed in a fictional story of the day, a play by Robert Greene, who thrived in Shakespeare's London. Called The Honorable History of Friar Bacon and Friar Bungay, published in played in 1594 originally, it centers on the creation of an artificial servant and the same cautionary themes of the perils of ingenuity that we've seen in the accounts of making homunculi and golems. And it also relies on the use of the sort of magical science combination that derives from the intellectual traditions used to make the homunculus and the golem, the Kabbalistic and alchemical ones. When one of the title characters of Green's play, the Friar Bacon, Roger Bacon, who was used as, he was a historical figure, of course, in the Middle Ages, but he became sort of a symbol of rogue ideas in the Renaissance. And when Bacon in this play, the character tries to create a talking, intelligent brass head, he ultimately signifies popular Elizabethan suspicion of bold innovators and arrogant ambition. His colleagues learn that Bacon's proto-robotic brass head is going to protect England by building a brass wall around it, and that it will also be able to lecture about philosophy. They scoff at Bacon's arrogance, one of them sniffing that he, quote, roves a bough beyond his reach, end quote. What they have a problem with is not just that Bacon is arrogant, but that his knowledge and abilities, about his knowledge and abilities, but also that he's so sure of his creation and its actions. He doesn't care for common conventions, nor does he pause to consider the propriety of what his metallic android will do. If the android can successfully give academic lectures, for instance, then who would need professors like Bacon and his colleagues? He would essentially be putting himself and his fellow academics out of work. Furthermore, although his idea to have the brass head build a protective wall around England might sound good to us, we have to remember the stratified Elizabethan society in which Green lived, especially the defensive paranoia of the English aristocracy of the time towards social mobility. In this context, and by the way, in my book, I reference the English sumptuary laws of the period put into effect by Henry VIII to back up this point of social mobility paranoia. In this context, Bacon's intention to have his robot build a brass wall would have seemed presumptuous and insulting to the Elizabethan aristocrats whose job it was to protect their country. It implies that their defenses are insufficient, that their recent victory against the Spanish Armada was a fluke, and worst of all, that an Oxford friar presumes to understand better how to protect England than those of the proper social class. And this all eerily foreshadows present-day issues dealing with AI. I'll get to that in a little bit. But first, Bacon's arrogance about his knowledge, about his metal automaton, and about his assumptions that his plans for it will be acceptable and beneficial to society presage today's situation regarding AI. Human slaves and artificial slaves enable greater power and agency on the part of their masters. However, the biggest worries of the ruling contingent of every culture, from Aristotle's to Shakespeare's to ours, are based on how strong and extended our servants' agency might become. Aristotle, for instance, warns in his Politics that human slaves can become rebellious, especially if they have had a taste of strong agency. For instance, if they were once powerful people before their enslavement, for instance, nobility. He says this in section 1255A of his Politics. In our own time, we worry about this with our own artificial slaves, especially the almost human ones we seem increasingly likely to have. Just consider the examples of this in the imaginative work of our day. Science fiction stories and movies are rife with apocalyptic scenarios where extremely smart AI flips the master-servant relationship. TV shows like Westworld and Battlestar Galactica, and films like Ex Machina and the Terminator series depict extremely powerful AI given the power of independent thought and the havoc this creates for their makers. The fact that such fiction reflects real worries is demonstrated by journalists' common use of the name of the last of these movies as a term for what people fear may happen with superintelligent AI, the Terminator scenario. In this situation, advanced AI becomes more intelligent than us, sees us as pests, and decides to just wipe us out. And I've written whole papers recently about the fact that many of those working on AI, such as Elon Musk, have the same fears. So, to conclude, ultimately, superhuman slaves and our worries about them reflect an archetypal need to supersede our natural limits by whatever ingenious means, even if by developing super powerful artificial servants, we threaten the very dominion that we seek. The literary accounts I've just discussed here, in other words, are about being blinded by our intellectual enthusiasm to the danger of our own intellectual products, becoming enslaved by those things that are meant to serve us, and being bound rather than liberated by the ambitions that produce them. On the other hand, they're also about the power and potential of our technology and know-how. These are the many elements they have in common with our present-day relationship to AI and the tales we tell ourselves about them. Thanks very much.